On the 5th of January 1942, as exultant shouts of victory resounded in the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Loroku Yamamoto instructed the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to begin preparing for the second stage of operations in the Pacific War. His study of the situation, reports on the Philippines, Malaya, and points south, indicated that Japanese troops in a few months would be in control of East Asia and the other areas they had attacked in December, so Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Madame Ugaki, that he wanted the plans to be completed by the middle of February. The speed with which the Japanese had conquered the Western Pacific astounded the planners in Tokyo and brought about sharp disagreement within the Imperial General Staff. The ardent military nationalists wanted to press on as long as Japan was victorious, no matter how far afield such planning led. Another group, represented by Admiral Yamamoto, had been less than enthusiastic about the opening of war with the United States and Britain, and worried about the future. One reason Yamamoto was at sea aboard the Combined Fleet flagship Yamato was that friends on the Imperial General Staff had worried that if he remained in Tokyo, he would be assassinated because of his public opposition to unlimited war. Even now, his opinions were no secret from those around him. His chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, wrote in his diary about the need for far-sighted statesmanship following this first month of glorious victory. Those were words that Yamamoto often used in warning that Japan could not war on the Western powers and hoped to win in the long run. Yamamoto's open criticism of the politicians was aimed at Prince Kuno and others who did not seem to know what sort of war Japan should wage in the Pacific. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with a friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusu-do organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto, warning his friend that war was inevitable because of decisions taken by the politicians, said that at first we'll have everything our own way, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. And now, just a month after the war had begun, the octopus was spread almost flat. Yamamoto, however, had also warned his old friend that the euphoria could not last. The time, he said, for political action was the moment that Singapore fell, that disaster would unsettle the British in India, and they would undoubtedly be willing to listen to talk of peace. Yamamoto knew the British well. He had been a member of the delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He also knew the Americans, and he had been Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 198. He agreed that once war was started by the politicians, a major victory must be won quickly. But when that victory was achieved, he believed Japan would have only a year and a half to bask. Glory, we must get a peace agreement by then, he told Sasakawa, and he looked to this old friend to carry the word among the right-wing political leaders who were in power on January 5. The victory seemed close at hand. The American battleship fleet had been put out of action at Pearl Harbor on December 7. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk off the Malay coast in the Philippines, Manila, and the United States naval base at Cavite had been captured. The British had surrendered at Hong Kong, and Japanese forces were on their way to new landings in the Dutch East Indies at Rabaul on New Ireland, Amba, and in the Solomon Islands. The attack at Pearl Harbor, however, had not accomplished all Yamamoto had hoped for. The destruction of the major elements of the United States fleet, the aircraft carriers which had been at sea, were unharmed and represented a constant threat. What was needed was a spectacular achievement, and Yamamoto did not expect the fall of Singapore for 5 or 6 months. It came on February 15. He believed that if he was to achieve his goal of setting up the stage for negotiation, he must move in another direction. But the question before his planners was where to strike next. The army vetoed Yamamoto's suggestion for an attack on the Soviet Union. Such a war would be fought almost entirely on land, and the army was heavily occupied in China and Southeast Asia, so 3 other ideas were offered. Yamamoto's favorite was to attack in the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet, and destroy it, as Yamamoto had destroyed the American ships at Pearl Harbor, and then push into the Middle East to link up with the Germans who were driving toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. Thus, the Japanese Navy would be assured of all the oil it needed. The Army refused to consider a Middle Eastern operation. So only two plans were left. One, advocated by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of that forward base of operations. After moving into the Solomon Islands, the Navy would take New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Advocates of this plan at Imperial General Headquarters were already setting up occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand. But Yamamoto did not like the Australia plan, because he thought it would take too long and still would not be spectacular enough to halt the Americans. Yamamoto also knew the Pearl Harbor attack had aroused the spirit of vengeance in people the Japanese had been learning to detest as soft and incompetent. Too soft, the Army said, to fight a war to the finish. It was apparent that even the capture of Singapore would not stop the Americans. Yamamoto wanted a victory that would make it possible for Japan to extend a generous olive branch. In January, Yamamoto ordered another plan drawn, and 2 months later sent officers to Tokyo with the document designated the Me Plan, which envisaged a battle off Midway Island, where the American carrier force would be destroyed. He also sent to Tokyo the AL Plan, which detailed the invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went well, Hawaii would be occupied, and later perhaps the West Coast. At least victories at Midway and in the oceans would give the politicians a base for negotiating the sort of peace that Yamamoto hoped to achieve in Tokyo. The admirals quarreled around the conference table in the Navy Ministry. But in the end, Yamamoto had his way. Forgot was the potential significance of the fall of Singapore in February and the impending collapse of Baton and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's purpose. The reason they were no longer important lay in the April raid of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron on Tokyo. The Doit raid had shocked the Japanese into a realization that the Americans were only beginning to fight in June. After the Midway operation flamed into disaster for Japan, there was no time for recrimination. Indeed, the Army did not even know the full extent of the defeat. The news of the destruction of 4 big fleet carriers was carefully suppressed so that it was known only at the highest levels of the Navy. While Yamamoto had been off on his Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had moved the Navy and its air forces steadily southward to set up the forthcoming attempt to cut off Australian naval forces. Had taken Rabaul on January 23, and from that time onward, they had conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands and New Guinea. It was apparent to the Australians, who communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur after his arrival in March, that the Japanese would soon move against New Guinea. If they were successful, it would be very nearly a walkover for the Japanese to take northern Australia in February. The Japanese had already bombed Darwin, and in March, when they invaded Samoa, New Guinea, the pace stepped up. In May, just before the Midway battle, the Japanese sent an occupation force toward Port Moresby, but it was turned back by the fierce defense of the Americans and Australians in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did occupy Chilagi north of Guadalcanal and built a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced plan in Washington and Australia that they had to prepare for a Japanese move in the South. MacArthur told the Australian government it must be ready for an attack before a Japanese thrust that was generally expected to be made against India. He cabled General Marshall for 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. But in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall that until the end of June he would have only 2 working carriers in the entire Pacific, while on the eve of Midway the Japanese had 10, and Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already given advance